Broadway, made up of more than 41 theaters, some of which house 500 seats or more, has continued catering to theater audiences in New York City and around the world. But it wasn't always full of the glitz and glamour it is today. Back in the 1700s, Lower Manhattan started with operas and Shakespearean plays. By the 1840s, Manhattan would see its first entertainment complex, a 3,000-seat venue, which would later house American showman P.T. Barnum's first exhibition. This venue, known as Niblo's Gardens, soon became one of New York's premier night spots, until fire would destroy it not once, but twice, all within a 26-year span. It wasn't until the late 1800s when New York City's theaters would start gradually moving from downtown up to Midtown Manhattan to a newly built and less expensive section of real estate, where they still operate today. The late 1800s proved to be not only a starting point for Broadway, but a decade of firsts, starting with its first long-run musical opera, The Elves, which played 50 performances. The Elves, starring Laura Keene and Kate Reynolds, would also see the first of two Broadway revivals, the first 9 years after the original, and the second revival 1 year later. Another first would come in 1866 when a production entitled The Black Crook, starring popular stage actress and singer Annie Baller, would open at Niblo's Garden. Comprised mainly of French romantic ballet and German melodrama, the production encompassed not only dance, but also music to help move its story. This would become one of the first musicals to shatter all previous long runs, with 474 performances and coming in at a whopping 5.5 hours long, making this one of the largest and longest performances in Broadway history. By the early 1900s, Broadway began transforming itself into what is known as the Great White Way. In order to appeal theatergoers, electric signs adorned with white bulbs were installed on the outside of theaters, thus showcasing Broadway's biggest stars and lights. The 1920s saw Broadway bring the emergence of American playwrights to the forefront, such as Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, George S. Kaufman, and George Bernard Shaw, proving there were audiences eager for serious dramas. The 1930s would see Broadway and the rest of the nation fall on hard times. The Great Depression meant Broadway would go dark, only to see a faint glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. This light would not come until 10 years later, when in 1943 a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical by the name of Oklahoma allowed Broadway to enter its golden age, with every season seeing new musical hits and new songs climbing the charts. Broadway was on the up and up, and by the 1950s, Broadway shows were forming the core of what defines musical theater today. The 1960s and 70s, however, brought hard times yet again to Broadway. With the culture divided and theaters needing major attention, many were forced to close their doors. With a drop in the number of shows produced on Broadway and only 59 productions, the Great White Way would thrive again. So in order to save what was once a thriving and glamorous area, a campaign was established in 1982 by then theatrical producer and director Joe Papp. This campaign, in support of the Actors Equity Union, helped save theater buildings from demolition and allowed Papp to provide resources such as actors, audio, lighting, and technical crews to help back the project. Then Mayor Ed Koch established a Theater Advisory Council, which would allow the Landmarks Preservation Commission to consider Broadway theaters not only on their historical significance, but also on their architectural merits. By the 1990s, a change would come to Broadway when the Walt Disney Company would make its debut on the Great White Way. In order to make Broadway family-friendly, a massive cleanup took place to remove the seediness and X-rated movie houses from the Times Square Theater District. Broadway was brought into a new light, bringing such shows as Beauty and the Beast, Sunset Boulevard, Miss Saigon, and Cats. which dazzled audiences in a brand new way. But as the story almost always goes, Broadway and the nation would soon face a tragedy beyond words. September 11th shed a darkness on the nation and an even darker fate on Broadway. With audiences hesitant to return to the theater, the stars of Broadway, many in costume, gathered in Times Square to perform New York, New York. This 30-second commercial, which ran on every major television network, as well as in movie theaters, helped entice theatergoers to come back to Broadway and see a show. Fast forward 20 years later, Broadway would face another blow to the industry, this time as an invisible viral outbreak known as COVID-19. With the closures of theaters across New York City and around the world, it had seemed the Great White Way had finally run its course into a great black darkness. But, as tragedy has always played a part since the early days of Broadway, the theater district wasn't throwing in the towel just yet. As cast members and out-of-work actors and actresses came together, they formed a collaboration in an attempt to keep the theater alive during this dark time. With the help of an online platform called Zoom, cast members and orchestra members from past and current shows performed songs from their productions, forming a strong connection between actors and audiences that would then help save productions around the world from closures. Broadway will continue to have its ups and downs, but it has shown the world that with every tragedy comes a new beginning, and assuring audiences now and in the future a safe place to come and see a show.